Hello everybody, Earth.Otherwise here to continue our journey into game programming in C++, start to finish by Eric Yuzwa. In this chapter, the book seeks to teach us about SDL and Windows. In this part, we'll be using Argo UML, or your UML of choice, to plan out the code we'll be making later. We'll be making several systems. At the start of a project, particularly if you don't have an engine to rely on, you'll need several systems to handle things like error checking and working with an initialization file. The book covers these basic parts of a game in this chapter, so I too will show you how to implement them using all the tools at our disposal. Now, before we actually start to code, we'll need to ask ourselves how we will be naming things like classes, variables, and functions. I'll leave a link to a Google style guide if you want to look into this more, but here are the basics. No one cares what you do so long as you don't break any of the basic rules. Standard code that everybody uses abides by certain rules so that we don't make code that will conflict. If you don't want to be messing with the definitions of the standard template library unless you really have to. Thus, you never want to use double underscores at the beginning of a name. You don't want to use an underscore and then a capital letter either. You also don't want to define anything in the std namespace, because that's standard stuff as well. Here are some other simple rules. 1. While you are allowed to use double underscores in certain scopes of names, it is easier to avoid doing so entirely. 2. As I mentioned earlier, do not use an underscore followed by a capital letter. 3. Avoid abbreviations when possible. 4. Function names have a descriptive verb like a get or set. 5. Types, such as classes, use a capital letter for each word. 6. Variables begin with a lowercase letter. Member variables start with an M, so that if you have public variables, you know when typing them out that they are part of a class, just in case you weren't aware of the fact that they were a member variable when typing them originally. It's suggested that you keep all letters lowercase in variable and member names, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But really, so long as you keep it consistent across code and don't mess with the standard code, no one cares. Doubly so for indie developers whose code will probably never be seen by anybody besides the 1 or 2 programmers. Onto the actual classes, structures, and functions we will need. First is the file logger. As it's described in game programming in C++ start to finish, this is a class which will log any error that the application throws in the event that the program does not have access to the console for some reason, or is unable to print to the console. Now, I'm going to be changing this class. First off, it's not a class. It doesn't need to be. Instead, our file logger will be Earth.Otherwise, in search engine name of choice. This will also not be an actual class. That's just what we're going to be calling the .h and .cpp files that will hold our functions. Simple fact is that this doesn't need to be a class. A class needs to be instantiated to be functional. Instead, we're just going to be creating a bunch of useful functions that we can insert into any code, so that if something we don't want to happen happens, the program will stop and tell us what's going on. The structure will be thus: a function called throw_console_error, which will pause the program and print the error to the console. A throw_file_error, which will save the error to a file that will be titled with the date and time, as well as one word about what kind of error it is, so that the errors are documented in chronological order, don't overwrite each other, and you might be able to solve the problem without even opening the file. These error functions will take parameters, which will tell it what to print, since each error will be unique. We know each error will be unique because if it weren't unique, then we'd probably be writing duplicate code, and we shouldn't be doing that. The console error will offer to continue the program, shut down the program, or restart the function which caused it to throw the error. This will be useful if we, say, misnamed a file, and can simply change the file name to the correct one in order to get everything rolling. There will be a final, or perhaps first, function called throw_error, which will be the function that we actually use. Here we will determine which error function we need to use. If the program is using the console, then it will throw a console error. Otherwise, it will throw a file error. We may have to specify this in the ini file, or the initialization file, which is the next thing we're going to talk about. That the ability to read a .ini file in Windows, or just a regular old file like text file called initialization in other on other operating systems, if you will. This ability to do this doesn't really need to be a class, since it doesn't hold any data that can be changed outside of itself. The code is pretty similar to the error code, just reading instead of writing, though later we'll want to write to this file if we, say, keep things like windowed or full screen and such in the ini file. Third, we will create a basic class from which we can inherit a few very important functions, which will keep us from leaking memory. Now, I also tend to use standard containers which do a memory cleanup when they exit, but it's good to keep track of these things. The more you can track in your game, the easier it becomes to locate problems and find interesting statistics. Fourth, we shall create our input class, which will get our inputs and call the necessary functions to get the program working. Finally, we shall create the window class and the main file that opens it. For being the stated task of this chapter, it's probably the easiest. The window class will contain the functions needed to open a window, and the main file will only really have to pass the arguments we need to pass to SDL to get a handle on our operating system queries and a call to our startup functions. Or if we put our game in a class, it'll have that class instead instanced. Like, say, if we put our entire game inside a class called application, then the main file would instantiate that class. Anyways, this has been Earth.Otherwise. This has been part 1 of chapter 3. I hope I see you in the next video.